just like every other fluid for our motorcycle, the coolant also needs to be checked and replaced periodically. And in fact, at least every 2 years, as coolant performance deteriorates with time. By coolant performance, I mean heat dissipation, protection against corrosion and freezing, and last but not least, lubrication. I'm Dr. Westrom, and I will demonstrate how to properly replace your coolant in this video. If you're an old subscriber, you know that this is a revisited topic, as an older video is already available on my channel. This time, however, I'm sharing a more detailed process along with tips based on your questions that you sent me over the years. This video is part of my cooling system maintenance series, so make sure to check the other related videos up here. Usually, and as a rule of thumb, the coolant change period is around 2 years, but this highly depends on the bike itself, what the manufacturer states, but also how often and how aggressive you ride, as well as if any other components need to be serviced and the fuel tank has to come off. Other reasons that make this change a necessity are the following. Coolant is a 50-50 mix of water and additives that inhibit corrosion in all cooling system parts, assist the heat transfer, protect against freezing during the winter cold months, and even lubricate the internal components of the cooling system, such as the pump, seals, etc. If the coolant is not changed on time, these additives lose their chemical properties, do not protect, and in fact may even assist corrosion if left for too long. A question that you often ask over the years is, can I simply top up the coolant? If you are very low on coolant and on the road, you can top up with the same coolant or temporarily with some distilled water, or if you cannot get your hands on either of those two, then with simple tap water, but only temporarily. Why temporarily? Well, because you need to make sure that your coolant throughout the system is a 50-50 mix and it has fresh additives with the expected chemical properties against corrosion, heat, and lubrication. Another important fact is that we never mix different brands and coolant colors, as the different chemicals may react and form a gel-like substance that stops coolant flow and clogs the system. If it's difficult to find the same coolant to use, or your motorcycle is some years old, you might consider flushing your cooling system first. Whatever product you end up using, make sure it is one specifically made for motorcycles and for aluminum alloys, as most motorcycle engines are made of these. In other words, avoid using a car coolant, as it may contain silicates or phosphates that can damage your seals and corrode magnesium and aluminum parts of the system. Can I freely dispose my old coolant? The answer is no, because as with other fluids, you need to dispose it into a proper center or gas station, as coolant is sweet and toxic and can kill pets that consume it by mistake. Next, remove whatever bodywork will give you access to your motorcycle's radiator cap, reservoir tank, and drain bolt on the water pump cover. Make sure that you check your owner's manual for their locations. First, locate your coolant drain bolt on your water pump cover. The radiator cap for this particular motorcycle is from the right side over here. The coolant reservoir tank for this model is under the seat. Depending on your motorcycle model, you might need to remove few or many parts, including the fuel tank, to perform this task. Whatever the case is, I always plan to perform other maintenance tasks together with the coolant change. For instance, I replace the spark plugs or clean or replace the air filter, etc. In this way, I remove all the parts, including the fuel tank for this particular model, once every 2 years. Now it would be also a good time to inspect or clean the hoses, the hose clamps and the radiator itself. Videos up here. This is the list of the tools, parts that you will need. This is our setup. Support the motorcycle upright. We have placed newspapers on the floor as well as on the motorcycle parts so that the coolant that is draining out does not make a mess. Make sure the engine is cold before you start, and definitely before you crack the radiator cap. It is important not to open the radiator cap first as the manual states, but instead first crack the drain bolt. It is the case that in some models there is no coolant drain bolt, and so what you do in this case, as specified by the owner's manual, is that you locate the lower radiator hose and you untight the clamp of the hose, you remove the hose and you empty or drain the coolant from there. So before cracking the radiator cap, first crack the coolant drain bolt. Use a socket of 10 with a socket wrench. As you can see, there is no coolant coming out, and that's because, as I advised, we have not removed the radiator cap yet. Make sure not to lose the coolant drain bolt washer. Take your empty bottle with the funnel, lift it to the height of the coolant drain bolt, and then slowly open the radiator cap. Make sure that you have the radiator cap at a point where the flow is constant but it's not pouring on you. Rock the motorcycle back and forth so that you remove more of the coolant. Next, we need to remove the coolant reservoir tank, which is under the seat. There is a tie wrap in this hose. Cut it open. Next, there are two bolts over here holding the bracket that holds the reservoir tank. So take your socket of size 10 and remove those two bolts. we have removed the hose. Once you have removed the two bolts from the bracket, you can free up the coolant reservoir tank, and then you can empty that in an empty container. There is also one clamp which you remove in this way, and then you take out the hose. Next, you may consider to wash your coolant reservoir tank with distilled water. So pour some inside and shake it and remove any residue that might be left. You have seen what residue it has removed, so it's a good idea to continue until it's completely clean. We have installed our reservoir tank, which is now cleaned back. Once the system is empty, clean the drain bolt opening with a clean rag. Take your drain bolt, ensure that the washer is still there, and finger tight it into position. Wipe once more. Take your socket wrench and socket of 10 and just snag it just a bit, not too much. We're going to drain the system at least one more time, but we will not just yet fill it with coolant. We will fill it with distilled water, and in this way we will rinse the old coolant that has remained still inside out, so that we can put fresh coolant in. First, we will fill our coolant reservoir tank with distilled water. So pick up a funnel, pour 250 ml in the container, and then in the coolant reservoir. Remove the funnel and put back the coolant reservoir tank cap. Next, we will fill the radiator, again with distilled water. When pouring the distilled water now or the coolant later, always do it slowly and in steps, because we want to avoid forcing air inside the radiator or the cooling system. The radiator is now topped either with coolant or with distilled water, and we will now try to remove any air pockets. So for this we will rock the bike slowly from side to side, and this will help remove any air pockets that are still inside. As a second step, place the bike on the side stand and let the bike sit there for a while. In the same way, this will help remove the air pockets. Indeed, now as you can see, there is now more room inside the radiator to put more coolant or more distilled water, whereas before the liquid was at the top. So we continue to fill the radiator until we top up again. Again, pour the distilled water or coolant slowly. Rock the bike from side to side one more time, and as you can hear, the coolant or the distilled water is moving inside and the air pockets are being removed. There is the sound of the air coming out. As a last step, place the bike on the side stand and leave for some time and start the engine. We will let the engine run for a few minutes so that the last remaining air is removed from the system. Then gently tap the thermostat to assist this process in the same way. Turn the engine off and then put the radiator cap back and secure it. Run the engine and let it run until the fan kicks in and the thermostat is open for the water pump to cycle the water through the system. 2 minutes after the fan kicks in, stop the engine and let it cool completely.
As you can hear, the fan has kicked in and it just stopped, so now we wait 2 more minutes with the engine running, and then we turn the engine off and we let it cool down completely.
Make sure the engine is cold before you start. First crack the coolant drain bolt. As you can see, the color of the liquid coming out is still blue, which means that although we filled our system with distilled water, it still has got the remaining coolant, and that's why we are doing this flush, so that we clean any remaining coolant from the system. Rock the motorcycle back and forth. As I mentioned before, we managed to free the coolant reservoir tank from the bracket, and now to empty the content of the coolant reservoir, we will simply lift it up to a higher level than the radiator level and so on. And in this way it will remove the content of the reservoir and it will drain out. For this, you of course need to also have your radiator cap open, so I'm starting to lift now. And as you see, the content is draining out. If you only need to top up the coolant reservoir tank or simply to remove its contents and you don't want to wash it because it doesn't have any residue or it's not too old, your motorcycle is not too old, then you probably do not need to remove it. And depending on the model, even for this bike, maybe you can get away without removing the fuel tank or the reservoir. For topping up, you can get away by using a transparent tube attached to the end of a small funnel, and I will show later on, I will demonstrate. To remove the contents, you may use a syringe, or you can even use a hand pump like this one that removes liquids, again attached to a transparent tube. So for a demonstration, you use the syringe and you extract the contents like so. Now keep in mind that in most cases this would be more than enough and you don't need to perform a cleansing flush unless your motorcycle is too old or it has a ton of miles or kilometers. Nevertheless, you may choose to also do a cleansing flush because the motorcycle has been sitting for a while or you are not sure how the previous owner has maintained it if you bought it second hand. You repeat the exact same process, only this time instead of using only distilled water, you fill in with a mildly acidic solution, which is a 50-50 ratio of distilled water and white vinegar, and this can remove contaminants and residue without harming the seals and the gaskets. You need to inspect the condition and the state of the washer, of its washer. If it's in a good state, you can reuse it. Otherwise, you can go ahead and get a replacement. For this motorcycle, this is the part number over here. Set your torque wrench to 13 Newton meters. Use a socket of 10 and tight the drain bolt to the specified torque. Now it's time to refill the bike with your coolant of choice. Now there's two ways to refill your coolant reservoir tank. It's either to remove completely the fuel tank as we showed before, or with a funnel and a transparent tube that I'm going to describe next. So this is our current setup for the next step, which is to top up the coolant reservoir tank. As you can see, the fuel tank is partially lifted, and for this what we have to do is to loosen these two bolts in the front of the fuel tank. Over here in the rear, remove this 12 bolt and then support the back side as usual using the prop, so that we don't have to remove any cables from inside because it's a fuss. But make sure that when you do this, you put the edge of the prop as back as possible so that you leave a reasonable gap here. So the plan is the following. You pick up a funnel, you pick up a transparent tube whose length is enough to reach the opening of the coolant reservoir tank. We will pass the transparent tube inside from the opening of the fuel tank and into the coolant reservoir tank, and in this way we have a way to top up until the full line level our coolant reservoir tank without removing completely the fuel tank. We are now slowly filling with our coolant of choice and we are topping up. And we put back the cap. We're going to put 1700 ml from the radiator side. We want to do that slowly because we don't want to force any air inside the radiator while doing this process. From side to side one more time. As a last step, place the bike on the side stand.
Then gently tap the thermostat.
Turn the engine off and then put the radiator cap back and secure it. Run the engine and let it run until the fan kicks in and the thermostat is open for the water pump to cycle the water through the system. 2 minutes after the fan kicks in, stop the engine and let it cool completely.
As you can hear, the fan has kicked in and it just stopped, so now we wait 2 more minutes with the engine running and then we turn the engine off. Now let the engine cool down completely, and I stress the word completely. Once this is done, you will notice that the coolant reservoir tank level has dropped after the heat and cool cycle, and indeed just before it was just below the full level line. Keep on refilling and repeating this process until when you see that the coolant reservoir level is just below full or the upper line. As I mentioned, we will dispose responsibly and we will dispose the old coolant together with the distilled water that came out into a nearby gas station or recycling center. Thanks for watching also this video. I hope it was as useful as the previous one, and don't forget to ride safe.